May the 18th, 1980. I'm Scott Brundage, and you're listening to Core Community Radio. We mentioned that it was almost impossible to get any news out of the site, the experts around Mount St. Helens that horrendous day. Almost impossible. It was, by my watch, 8:05 in the morning when I arrived at work at KOZI Radio in Chelan. Normally I didn't work on Sundays, but I wanted to go in and, check on the mountain, to be honest. We had a fellow there who would go in on Sunday mornings early, put some network news on, and then start to put on the air various religious programs that were there every Sunday morning. Nice young fellow. Wanted to be really helpful. Well, when I went in, I had a strange feeling that something might be going on. And I looked at the wire services and they said there was nothing new really to report, but there had been reports that the earthquake activity under the mountain was very heavy that morning in terms of frequency. So I looked at this young fellow, Wes was his name, and I said, Wes, would you mind getting ready in case something happens here? Just make sure that there's a decent sized pile of tapes that we have to record any interviews that I might be doing this morning, or God forbid if we have to go on the air live. And he did. Unfortunately, in this huge supply house of audio tapes the radio station was in those days, he picked the wrong stack. He went and in his logic said, well, these are labeled Mount St. Helens this and St. Helens that and so on. Fairly large reels, and so he not only had those stacked up, he went and erased them. I was devastated. The first eruption of May 18th, 1980 was in the studio at KOZI Radio. It was my rather shrill, I'm afraid, oh my God. There were many, many phone calls recorded over a 2-month plus time. I'd built up relationships with people around the mountain, getting news of interest, but the idea was to have that material there in case a major eruption occurred, and we could use some of it again. Back last week, so-and-so said this, and that kind of thing. But also there was an interview I had done with a ham radio operator who had volunteered and was working near the mountain. So the information that I had gotten from him and had on the tape about what ham radio operators in what towns were doing what to set up a communication system in case things went wrong was gone. No phone numbers, no names. Of course, they didn't need me. We needed them. What we wound up with was a recording of a fellow at the other end of a phone when I finally got through on the telephone to a spokesman for the USGS more than half an hour after the eruption had started. And what we had on tape was him saying hello, then me saying, I'm Scott Brundage with KOZI, and him saying, oh, hi, Scott, and me saying, is there something going on there? And then him saying, oh boy, is there ever. And then I said, what? And he said, I have no way of knowing. I can't see anything but gray. And communications are down. That was it. That was the news we had. Until Jerry Eisenhart, who owned the radio station, remembered a guy in Yakima, Washington, and when the Associated Press mentioned that the cloud was approaching Yakima, Jerry got in touch with him. He was a ham radio operator. He gave Jerry all kinds of secondhand information, but it sure helped for us to have some kind of evidence about what was going on. And one of the things he told Jerry is, Jerry, he had just looked out the window, Jerry, it has gone dark. Yes, it has gone dark in Yakima. I mean, nighttime, black, dark. Only the street lights were on, and you couldn't see them for very far. Well, ham radio operators were important that day. That day, at 8:32 a.m., a young man named Jerry Martin, who was a ham radio operator, had volunteered, along with some 300 others, to help out in communications around the volcano. Ham radio operators, by the way, for you who were younger than, say, 30 that day, they were the cell phones of the day. Not many people had them. You had to do a lot of studying, a lot of technical studying, get a license, and so on. But it was as close to a cell phone as you were going to get. They had powerful shortwave radios, and if you were in the military, you know how valuable they were, because you could call home from Vietnam or from Korea or from anywhere in the world. But it was very expensive through phone companies, and it was these ham radio operators volunteering who would connect you from your telephone somewhere in the world to a radio operator on shortwave there, who would relay to another and to another and to ships at sea and to ham operators in the U.S. to the telephone you wanted to call. It was a complex system, and these were highly dedicated people, and they're still out there and still very valuable, just that we don't hear much about them now because we have our own cell phones. Jerry Martin was one of the guys who had volunteered to be right on the volcano. Also there was another ham radio operator named Reed Blackburn, also on the mountain at a different location. Jerry Martin, at 8:32, radioed to emergency service headquarters that the eruption had begun and was never heard from again. High enough up on the mountain, his body was never recovered. Reed's body was. He never got off a transmission that morning, but he also was high up on the mountain. He was in a pickup truck, which a few days after, the winds blowing the ash that had covered it, uncovered it, and his body was found. There was another fellow, though, a fellow who was on one of those tapes that was destroyed by the well-meaning part-time worker. His name was Dave Lawrence, and he was an engineer working for the USGS and NOAA, and he was a highly recognized in his field volcanologist. And he was in the minority on Mount St. Helens. The majority of volcanologists there believed that while the side of the mountain did have a bulge, yes, since most of the history of Mount St. Helens was that eruptions occurred at the top, out the top, although not all. One, in fact, at around 1840 or so had occurred out the side. Most of them believed it was most likely that that's where this eruption would occur, out the top. Dave Lawrence was the fellow who came on the phone when I asked for a volcanologist to talk to, about a week before the eruption went off. And one of the questions I asked him was what he believed was going to happen. He described what eventually did happen to a T. And we made a joke together, he and I, that was on one of those erased tapes. The joke was, he said to me, "What are you doing next weekend?" And I said, "I'm at the lake." And he said, "I'm on the mountain." And I asked him, "Where on the mountain?" And he said, "Well, I'm going to be," I believe it was called Coldwater 1. At any rate, I'm going to be at this observation point, and it's going to be a great view if anything happens, because from there, I can see right where that bulge, just right near the bottom of it, and that would be a great vantage point. You see, the various people there rotated where their duty station for a day would be on the mountain at the various observation points. He said some of the guys had volunteered to take his turns there because that's near where I think it's going to erupt. And he chuckled. And he said, "But who would ever want to be anywhere else?" At 8:32, May 18th, 1980, Dave Lawrence was at that site. And that Sunday morning, there was an earthquake, and he keyed a microphone on his own two-way radio to headquarters and said with great excitement, "Vancouver, Vancouver, this is it." He was never recovered either. Mount St. Helens was a great deal more than an interesting event that some of us are still around went through. It was a great deal more than a terribly frightening event, which it was. It was an incredible natural disaster. One that we should not forget. We should remember those heroes like the ham radio operators and like Dave Johnson, who believed he was going to be right where it all came out if he went there at his turn, and he did. When we speak of heroes, there are a lot more of them than soldiers, than the people we admire and who have guided our lives. They're heroes too. Dave Johnson, I believe I said his name was Lawrence. His name was Johnson. Dave Johnson was a hero of the ultimate kind. So was a Forest Service ranger who 2 months before had been told probably nothing much is going to happen there. Probably. But when they were told that, he and his buddies, he's the one who raised his hand and said he'd go on up there in the highest cabin the Forest Service had and watch the mountain to let them know if anything at all happened, because most likely, if anything happened, it'd be a little steam vent. But still, it could blow up. He went up there. I wound up making a phone call to him. And as we spoke, I said, well, what's it doing right now at this moment, as I was recording an interview with him? Oh, at this moment? He said, well, I don't know. Just a minute. And I could hear him get up. A few seconds later, he came back and said, well, nothing right now. And then, as I started yet another question, he said, sir, I really hate to interrupt, but I have to tell you, they told me, well, see, in order to see what is going on up there, I have to get up and go to the window because this phone is not where I can see. And I'd really like to be able to see. That was a man willing to risk his life to get the word out, to warn people. Mount St. Helens, a big splash, a big boom. But it talks to me this very day, and I've never been there. And it speaks of ham radio operators and Forest Service Ranger and Dave Johnson. Heroes. I hope your memories, if you have them, of Mount St. Helens are now pleasant. Mine are now. It puts a smile on my face to think of the caliber of people who are